Good morning, all. Good evening, all, from whatever part of the world you're joining. It's absolutely a pleasure to have you all with us for yet another interaction, what we call as the India Dialogue Conversations. As you know, this is a joint effort between the Institute for Competitiveness and USADMC. So Richard Dasher and I do these conversations generally, but unfortunately, Richard is not able to join today because he's traveling to Japan, and it must be a very difficult hour out there. And he's just possibly landed in Japan. But we will still continue this interaction. And we have a very special guest and a friend here today, who's Kevin Stolarick. And Kevin is Dean of the Kuttner Urban Leadership Program at Urban Land Institute in Toronto. Somebody who's also been called as the official statistician of the creative class. And this is where I should tell a story. I've known Kevin for at least a decade and a half. And as a friend, as a brother, as a colleague, as a collaborator, as family, I think we have always said that we are brothers who are separated and from two different mothers or whatever. So, but then I think he's just been one of the dearest collaborators over a period of time. We have done some work in terms of reports as well, which is the creative economy of Indian cities and Indian states, which was a very significant report at that point in time. We are now looking at updating it as well because we have some newer data coming in. Of course, it's going to be after a gap of about 10 years, but it's still significant body of work. And we've always looked at doing a book together on urbanization. It is in the works for the last decade or so, but I think it is going to happen sometime soon. In fact, Kevin has been such a great friend or an admirer of India. He actually did a trip to something like close to 20 odd cities or 30 odd cities over a period of 1 month when he was in India. He really wanted to see how the urbanization process unfolds. And that was done possibly in 2018, 2019, just pre-COVID, and we are all set. And we have done some exceptional discussions over that. But from his experience of going around in India, his work that he has done on India, he comes as a very interesting expert who can really talk or share as a person who's looking from a 35,000 feet view to even something penetrating deep inside. So that's where it is. So, Kevin, it is such a pleasure to have you here today. Thanks a lot for joining in.
Thank you. It's yes, 35 cities and 35 days.
Yeah, so I know like that was one very significant.
I always like to claim I have visited every state in India except Jammu and Kashmir, but I've been to more parts of India than most Indians.
And possibly that is true, and that holds true for me as well. I don't think I've visited more of India than you, but let's dive into this conversation. So, like we've always said something very interesting in our interactions, and the title of the talk was also driven by that: inconvenience regretted. You've also always made a statement that Indian cities are a very interesting enigma. They are something what you would always say in a state of continuous growth or continuous build-up. And you say it's about inconvenience. Like, what is it that you're really trying to delve into or suggest?
Well, I mean, it's a bunch of things, right? And I think one of them actually, I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot around urbanization in India is how the government actually quite actively discourages it. I think there are lots of things that where the government and I think I think it's actually quite smart. It's actually been, I think, a very smart move in that if you look at, I mean, even, just to look, next door at Pakistan, or you look to Africa, places where kind of cities have been allowed to grow without bound, right? Where, the kind of people know that economic opportunity is in cities, and so they move to Dhaka, they move to wherever, right? But then these massive mega cities become giant slums because the infrastructure can't keep up. Right. And so one of the things, if you really look at it, the policies, the way that the kind of federal policies and things, they're not actively encouraging people to stay on the farm necessarily or to stay in the village, but they're not really encouraging them to move to the cities, right? And so I think, and that has, I think, allowed for more managed growth. I mean, you compare the Indian experience to the Chinese experience, where the Chinese said, "Oh, well, we can just build cities in the middle of nowhere and people will move to them." They discovered how wrong they were, right? And so for India, it was like, no, we want to grow, and we know that economic activity and economic growth is going to come from cities, and they're really important, and all of the things that you and I have worked on for years, right? Talking about all this stuff, but that it needs to be managed, right? We need to be able to kind of keep pace, and not let it go so overboard. It still goes overboard. I think the majority of the population of Mumbai still lives in a slum, right? Or in informal housing. And so it's not as if there aren't problems and issues, but they're much less than they would be. And so I think the idea of the whole kind of inconvenience regretted, right? This is the sign that gets put up, right? Whenever they're doing something, well, inconvenience. And I always love that phrase, it's a British phrase, of course, right? But I always love it because it's like, well, we're not really apologizing. We're not telling you we're sorry for this. We're just regretting that you're inconvenienced. But I think it is this kind of reflection of saying, look, we need to grow. You look at metros and roads and in all the infrastructure pieces, right? And all the work and investment in the stuff that's been happening, and it's still allowing, the cities are still growing tremendously, right? This is the whole still the basis of the book is talking about how this growth has happened and why it's happened, and why I spent 35 days by train, car, plane, foot, I think, getting from all these different places across India to be able to look at and understand and see, right, and see what's happening and how things are happening. And so there's tons of stuff and lots of activity and lots of things that are going on, but it is very much moderated, right? It's saying we don't want this to go so, because if you let it go crazy, then it kind of blossoms out of control and you end up without a lot more poverty, right? Your cities become havens of poverty and large concentrations of people, and not enough jobs and things to keep them all busy. And so I think it really is a reflection of the way that urbanization itself has been approached.
So that's a very fascinating point, like the government actively discourages or whatever, because of course you're saying that if they really people pour into cities or come into cities, there are not possibly enough jobs or whatever. Can you delve a little more into it, a deeper reflection in terms of saying as to uh, how they are really making sure, like what is that, what I call underlying behavior that possibly government is emanating? What are those signs, stealth signs that you see here? Because that's what you're saying is something very fascinating, and we possibly in India don't look at it that way.
Well, I think what you see is there's a variety of things that are happening. One is you do get, as part of my 35 days, one of the days I actually spent the entire day with a local guide in Dharavi, right? So going, and we were specifically looking at businesses, right? I was spending time talking to business owners, people who had and were running businesses, right? Who were creating their own economic opportunity in the largest slum in the country, right? But how they were doing that and what they were doing and why they were doing it and the things that were leading them there. And so you see there is economic opportunity that people are finding in cities, right? And they're creating it themselves, right? They're doing opportunities to create it themselves. The reason that I think you see the government's kind of trying to kind of put the brakes on it, if you will, right, is that they're doing things to encourage development, more local development, for things to be happening in the village. So whether it's industrial parks or educational opportunities or other things, and not making it easy for people to move to the cities, right? So yes, I spent time I think it was when I was in Bangalore, and I was promptly informed Bangalore does not have any slums. No matter all those things I saw that no, those are not slums. Bangalore does not have any slums, right? And part of that is they have a whole bunch of government housing that they built. They still have slums, of course, but right, there's all this government housing that they built so they could move people out. But you don't see a lot of that happening, in Delhi, in Mumbai, in some of the major cities, where they're again making it easy for people, right? It's like, okay, if you're going to come, you're going to come. We're not going to make it easy for you to come, and you're going to have to be able to, and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, which I think would be appropriately Indian, and say, no, you're going to make this work, right? But we're not going to make it easy for you. We're not going to, again, maybe not discouraging, but we're not going to encourage you to come, and we're going to try to encourage you to stay put. And I think you do see lots of programs that are really geared towards helping people thrive and be successful in the villages and in the rural communities and doing things that way so that they're not automatically saying, oh, my only opportunity is if I move to the city.
Mhm. And so, of course, you did talk about growth in India and so on and so forth. How do you really look at India per se in today's context? Of course, your last visit was about 5 years ago, pre-COVID, but you've been a keen student of India. How do you really look at the India challenge or in the India story right now?
I think it has been and continues to be, it's like poised right there. It amazes me to see how successful India is in so many places, and then how much it kind of falls flat on its face. Where it's like it's like right there. It's like, I mean, and part of it is, I mean, there's a bunch of things that are happening, right? And but you know, it's like even more recently, you look at, you know, what's happening in China now, right? And obviously, I mean, the major competition is between India and China, has been for a long time, continues to be. I think in many ways India is winning that competition. I think China won't say it, but I think recognizes it as well, that India has done a much better job of kind of more, not necessarily, and still even, I mean, and even the stuff that's going on with Russia now and cheap oil, right? I think India still manages to keep itself kind of squarely in the middle. You know, we were just talking about, or before we started, about the kind of some of the challenging relationships right now between India and Canada, which is foolish and ridiculous and totally Canada's fault, I will say, but or our current prime minister perhaps, but even so, with like the U.S., they've, you know, things have, but, you know, somewhat better, and so it's kind of still kind of staying in the, you know, a good kind of middle ground, that I think has been quite successful. And so I do think that as an economy, and, you know, as an emerged economy, not even emerging, it's, you know, and for the kind of activity and with all the global things that are going on and all of the things that are happening locally, right? Even with around COVID and the shift to, I mean, people keep talking about the kind of shift to manufacturing back to insourcing and doing things locally in the US. Well, that's true, but it's also true that places that already have a lot of that stuff already are going to be much more successful because they've already got it, right? And India is one of those places. So I do think that it's incredibly well positioned on a kind of global scale, right? To be a place that can just really just take off. Because it has kind of all of these elements in place, that are going to make it successful.
Mhm. But that's fascinating. But let's take a step back into, say, the whole idea of cities itself, because I do fundamentally see that cities are the driving force of economic activity within India. Some numbers to share with you, that the top 100 districts, which are possibly the top 100 cities as well in India, they contribute close to about 85% to 90% of India's GDP. So that means it's the city centers which are driving it. But you make a very important point, and that is about jugaad, when you always talk about urbanization and things. And why am I sharing these numbers? Is something interesting. Like 90% of GDP is coming from 100 locations, and then suddenly you're talking about jugaad at one point. What is it that you're really trying to transcend or share?
So I think what's interesting, and this goes back to it ties back to the point I was making about kind of managing the growth, right? In that what you see, growth is not urbanization, right? Urbanization is not always economic success, right? Ed Glazer, a bunch of other people, right, have spent a bunch of time talking about this. And I said, you look at some of the largest cities or, you know, agglomerations in the world are, you've got some in Pakistan, in Africa, in places, right? But they are incredibly impoverished. Right? So growth on its own is not always success. So what that means, though, is, but generally, right, cities lead to much greater shares of economic activity, GDP, productivity, all kinds of other measures, right? Cities are by far, right, the giant contributors to this stuff. So clearly there's a sweet spot, right? There's a, you know, you grow too fast, too much, and suddenly you kind of go over the edge and you get caught up in a downward spiral, right, of poverty and everything, right? So you need to grow, but you need to grow in a more managed way, or in such a way that you're not terribly negatively impacting all the productivity impacts and the other things that are going on. And so that's where I think the idea kind of Jugad urbanization comes in, right? I mean, a Jugad, for those who don't know, right? Those who happen not to speak Punjabi, but a Jugad, right, is this, what my dad always used to call close enough for government, right? It's something that works. It's not perfect, right? But it works. It's a Jugad, right? And I think it's a wonderful idea, right? And it's this, it's satisfying and actually, right? You're at Stanford right now, and Stanford has done some amazing things actually talking about Jugad through innovation in general, right? All kinds of things on Jugad innovation and understanding that. But I think understanding urbanization in that way and saying, look, yeah, it's not ideal, right? Could you have brought in somebody and done it even better and planned the hell out of it and managed it and everything else, right? And come up with perhaps a better solution? Sure, right? But this solution works, and so it's generally faster and more. It can be more efficient and can be accomplished a lot more quickly. Your parents, I know, right, live in a city completely designed and built by Cavoursier, right? You brought in the famous urban planner, right, to build Chandigarh, and he built a very lovely city that is not really successful, right? It's the outskirts of Chandigarh, the parts that Cavoursier didn't build that are really successful, right? Chandigarh is this little locked in amber precious thing because this is what Cavoursier designed, right? And so we still keep the wide boulevards and the low buildings and all of this stuff. And it's like, yeah, but that doesn't work, right? It's the living, breathing places, right, that are the Jugad urbanization, right? Outside the city, those are the places that are actually where there's lots of excitement and energy and economic activity and growth.
So when you're saying this, so like my first question is that should we say it is frugal innovation, or is it just about Jugad could also mean shortcuts, the short way of doing it? So what are you really wanting to say here for
well, I think Jugad, I think the important thing about Jugad is that it still functions, right? That it is workable. You're not talking about shortcuts, right? Necessarily that are just a shortcut. So to pull from recent news, perhaps the Boeing Corporation has been employing a few too many shortcuts, right? And it's getting them lots of issues, right? And so it isn't. It's not that, right? The thing about it, I always think of the thing for what you got is that yes, it's not. It might not be the optimal depending on how you're looking at it, but it's very serviceable and it has to work, right? One of the things, right? I mean, when I was there for my 35 cities in 35 days, right? I have a whole collection of photographs because I took a photographer with me, right, who was fabulous. I'm like, take pictures of this, take pictures of this, just to be able to catch and see some of the amazing things that people do to make urban living, to make living in the city work for them, or to make the city itself work. And they're small fixes. There are lots of little things, but they are things that they make it better, right? It's still improving things. It's still making it better. And so I think the idea of thinking of urbanization in that way is that you still are making the city a better place, and you're making it more efficient and effective. But it's not necessarily, it's not the optimum, right? But again, optimums can be, and I think also, I know you and I have talked in the past about a lot of the kind of smart city stuff. And a lot of the challenge and the problem with a lot of the smart city stuff is that tends to be the kind of anti-Jugad view, right? It's that's very carefully planned and structured, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to put all these things in place, right? And like magic, it will fix the city and will give us this incredible thing. And then it generally doesn't, right? Cities, turns out, are as Jane Jacobs pointed out decades ago, right? Cities are messy, complicated places. And so really trying to make them work means that they're constantly changing and evolving. And I think if you understand that urbanization is a kind of a collection of Jugad innovations, right? The other thing that says is, I'm not locked into what I've done. It's like, okay, well, this works, but I might be able to find something better that I can do next, right? And so it allows it for more of an evolutionary kind of feel for what's going on.
So, Kevin, this is fascinating. And of course, you were talking about, say, Chandigarh as a region, wherein, say, there are those outside cities which are the hotspots in terms of where economic activity is happening, and possibly rightfully so. But does that not mean that when you suddenly have this very well-planned city at one end, and there is this whole lot of messy urbanization, as you would actually put it, uh, does it not have a long-term implication in terms of how people will move, how goods will move, because it will have a severe issue in terms of, say, either governance issues or infrastructure issues or movement issues? How do you really look at that?
Well, I mean, the problem is, I guess the challenge is that by kind of if you will, intentionally going for the quicker fix, the shorter term solution, you end up, you do kind of you sacrifice the long-term, perhaps better global optimum solution. So you're not necessarily, you are not, it's like, well, I'm finding a good solution that works for here in this context. And the cost may be that I don't have, right? That what I don't have is I don't have the bigger, broader global solution. And so what seems to kind of work the best, and this is just from looking at cities and trying to see what's really going on. What seems to really work the best is you kind of lay down the big pieces. You kind of put if you will, the infrastructure, the structural part of infrastructure, right? The bigger, put those pieces, make sure you've got what you need there for transportation, for if it's data, electricity, water, sewer, right? The major infrastructure pieces, right? That you get that stuff kind of laid down. And then let it build around that, right? Let this, kind of stuff happen around it. I always like to, to point out one of the things that I think is really interesting, right? If somebody is planning a new subdivision in India, I don't care, pick whatever city you want to. You're gonna put in a new subdivision. You're gonna build a whole bunch of lovely townhouses for people, right? And they're gonna acquire 100 acres of land, right? And they're gonna take 5 acres in one corner and kind of set it aside and say, well, we're just saving this, right? And we'll develop all the rest of it, and we'll build it, and we'll do all this stuff, and we'll put in, we'll build all these houses and sell them and all the rest. And miraculously enough, right, that 5 acres that was kind of just still there, that was still vacant, suddenly finds itself occupied, right, by a whole bunch of Bangladeshi service workers, right, who build their houses there, who create a slum, right, that is servicing, and they are working at and supporting all of the people who were living in the subdivision. Now, is that wrong? Is that evil? Is that how do you want to think about that? Why don't you just build worker housing when you're building housing? Well, they'll build their own, right? But yet it's part of the planning process. It's part of it's saying, no, we're going to allow for this to happen. We're going to recognize that, in fact, right, we're going to need all these houses are going to need cooks and housekeepers and cleaners and people to watch kids and whatever else, right? And there's an entire, basically class, if you will, of people, right, in India, many of whom are not necessarily even in India legally, but who will take these jobs, work for cash, do the work, but need a place to live, right? And can't afford, right, and what they're being paid and for what's going on, they can't afford to pay a huge amounts of rent for a place, right? So they build their own place, right? Or they find they share with a whole bunch of other families. And so that organic nature of that, right? And how that kind of develops, and it's what happens, right? Is it, let's say, good or bad, but it's realistic, I think, right? So if you're gonna build a subdivision, you don't leave room for the slum, then no one's gonna want to buy it, because everyone will move in and they're like, wait, I can't hire any help. I need help. I need to be able to hire staff, and I can't do that because they can't live. There's no place for them to live.
So, like you've also said that in the past, and you did allude to Dharavi as a point. What I really see you saying is that slums are possibly the ultimate in Jugaad innovation, right? That is what you're possibly alluding to.
They are, yeah, I agree with that, yeah.
And is this a process that should get embedded, or we should let it be? Because it raises a very huge governance question over a period of time as to how do we govern cities? What do we do?
So I have very mixed feelings about this one. Okay, my small p progressive little L liberal heartstrings are like, no, no, this is terrible. You can't do this. How can? But at the same time, I remember a conversation I had in Dharavi. So I met a guy who had a business. I was mainly talking to business owners, right? And he had, and all of the, I mean, the house, right? Dharavi is literally built on a landfill, right? All the housing, all the houses, everything that was built there is all haphazard, right? Um, he had the second floor of a two-story. There was some shops below, and then up above, and he had a small space that he was renting, I don't know, paying for, whatever, that was his space, where he lived and worked. And his work was that he was throwing pots. So actually had a potter's wheel, and he would get clay, was doing terracotta. And then outside the window, on the roofs of all of the buildings around him, were the pots that he had already done, that where he would lay them out on the roofs to dry. And so we were just talking about like him and being there and what was going on and all the rest. And at one point he looked at me, and he very, it was just like, he's like, who needs anything else? He's like, I've got a great place to work. I get to do the things I want to do. I have, I have a roof over my head. I can feed my family. Why would anybody need more than this? Why do I need, why would I need a big shop or a big floor or whatever? Why would I, and he was, I mean, it was very earnest. He was just like, I don't understand, right? I don't know why I would have to kind of develop more or progress, or why should you be bigger, or why should you need more money, or why? It's like, why, what else would I need? I have what I need right here. I can do the things that I want to do, right? And be successful and help my neighbors and do whatever. And so that kind of attitude, right, of understanding how people are living, and that in fact what you see if you look at like Dharavi and other places, right? Yes, there's poverty and there's challenges and there's issues and there's all kinds of problems, but there are also an awful lot of people that are incredibly resilient and are incredibly smart and are actually quite successful in their own way at what they're doing. And I said this was a great, because I was really looking at the economic activity, right? The amount of we've talked about this before. The informal economy in India may be just about as big as the formal economy, right? It's hard to tell, but it's very large and it's huge. And that's what Dharavi is, right? It's all this stuff that they're doing. People working on recycling and all kinds of other activities, right, that are happening within the confines of that fairly small space with a ton of people in it. But they're making it work. And so I do think that the idea, right, of kind of slums as jugad is like, well, look, it's people making it work. It's not, I mean, if the one other thing that I always think is really clear from this is if people who, especially in India, I think people who get to the slums can still get back home, right? They've come from somewhere. They're not so trapped that they don't feel like they couldn't get back home if they wanted to, but they don't want to go back home. They still feel that their life is better, even though they don't necessarily have a solid roof over their head, but their kids have better access to school, or they have better access to healthcare, or they have better economic. They're finding that they're creating opportunities for themselves. They can create opportunities for themselves, that they have a better life where they are than where they were before. They feel that it's better. And so if people are improving their lot in life, why do you want to stop them? That's, so yeah, I mean, should you get rid of slums? Yeah, it's not a good thing, right? It's not, there's a whole bunch of things, and there are a whole bunch of issues and challenges, but there also is a lot of energy and a lot of intelligence and a lot of things. It's not that it's, poor, starving people who are just sitting there waiting for someone to bring them food and handouts. No, it's people who are working their butts off and doing everything they can to try to build a better life for themselves and their family, and they found that this is the way that they can do it. So it might be a small step, but it's still a step up. And do you take that away? So that I think is the bigger question.
So I think that's important. Like, of course, you can't take it away, but there is a typical question that will arise in my mind. And that is that how do we look at improving the quality of lives of these citizens? Can we do something about it, or let it be like that, or let it just function the way it is functioning? Of course, he's taken a step up when he moves from a village, but there's a certain standard that the world looks at. Are we looking at those standards wrongly, or are we just getting everything wrong?
Well, I mean, the UN SDGs are a wonderful thing, right? And to try to build, and I think you always do want to try to move. I mean, I think it's not only government's lot, but as good citizens, all of us, right, to try to make things better for our fellow citizens. So I mean, it's not as if I think it, it it's not that you want to, again, to not get rid of them, but to say yeah, you do still want to try to help and to try to, but I think it's not it's a hand up and not a hand out, and it's still more of an under. What I find is interesting is and it's interesting. I mean, I've had some conversations around this with some people in the States, right, who kind of talk about what they kind of call the nonprofit industrial complex, uh, right? Which is you have all of these organizations that exist to help people. And therefore, the people that they're trying to help, be they in, inner city New York or San Francisco or wherever, Chicago, right? If they're not helping people in the way that they need to help them, then then something's wrong. And so, but they don't see the people themselves become they don't have any agency, right? They're actually seen as people who need a handout, right? And that our job is to we're helping these people, we're helping these people. And in fact, having talked to some of the people in those situations, like, yeah, I really wish they would go away, because we can handle ourselves, we can take care of things, we can do stuff. We might need some help in certain areas, but these kinds of organizations don't they have a very specific thing and framework that they want to work in, and stuff that they want to do. And if you don't fit their model, then you don't, they can't help you, or they won't help you. And so it creates a dependency problem, right? Where it's like they're so people end up being so dependent on the handout that they actually aren't able to kind of again pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, right? And try to make it successful. So I think it's trying to figure out, as I said, what really enlightened me, right, my day in Dharavi, was that how smart the people that were there were, right? It's not like these were, poor, stupid, downtrodden people who were living in a slum. No, these are very smart people who managed to get to the city and figure out how to make a life for themselves and their families and others, and the way what they had to do that and how they had to do it. So it's how do you tap that, right? How do you tap that energy and that entrepreneurship and the stuff that's going on, and saying, wait, if you can do that, if I can give you, and it kind of goes back to the microloan idea and stuff, right? Small amounts, small things that you can do. It may not be so much, as in Bangalore, we have no slums because we built all this housing, right? And quite honestly, right, for a lot of it, they've managed to turn the housing into slums. Okay, it's government housing, but guess what? It looks and runs just like what I saw in Dharavi, but okay, no slums. Uh, but it is that, right? How do you, it's more to you, how do you tap and allow people to use their own energy and their own, and what they already have, right? And kind of help them build on that. So I think, yes, social development goals are wonderful and great, and the kinds of things you need to do, but you don't want to impose them on people. You want to kind of use it as saying, how do we help leverage what they're already doing and make it better for them?
Well, this is fascinating, Kevin. But let's take a step forward on this. But like you did talk about cities, and you did start talking about Chandigarh. But I think you also went to places like, say, Jaipur or Varanasi, and you actually had your experiences. How do you say? Of course, you've said a very interesting point about Dharavi as to how it is a hotspot in terms of some very smart activity, like smart people who are doing some very interesting stuff. They're making a life of themselves. But how do you really look at, say, places like, say, Dharavi vis-a-vis Chandigarh, vis-a-vis Jaipur, vis-a-vis Varanasi, or whatever?
I mean, I think you have it at different levels of a lot of the same kinds of things, right? I mean, I think you have a lot of people who are doing other things to try to be, to create their own success, right? Whether it is within even a more of a corporate framework, right, or the corporations themselves and what they're doing, right? I mean, you can look at the all of the things that are happening around Delhi, right, where it's more corporate and you've got a lot of kind of, lots of businesses and a lot of things are happening, and there's still lots of people working within that framework, right? I said, one of my, favorites was watching the various shifts of workers, right, as they were coming into the offices, right? Actually by where you live, right? And so it's one of these of, it's like, well, first you get all of the blue shirts because it's the cleaners and the security guards show up, right? And then shortly after that, you've got the really, and basically it's like all young boys in their white shirts because they're the office boys, right? And they're coming in before, and then the office workers show up, right? You've got these waves of people at different times who were coming and going, right? And they kind of leave in reverse order as well, right? The cleaners and security guards work longer hours, the office boys work longer hours, that. But you've got and so people understanding and working with and trying to make it work. And you've got the people who were working for themselves and doing stuff within markets or small businesses or small manufacturing and other firms or other kinds of business and stuff that way. So I think I think it's pretty clear, even if you look at the diaspora from India as well, right? Very much an entrepreneurial kind of ethos, right? And people willing to do what they need to do to find success for themselves and their families, right? I always point out, I said, the largest disbursements, right? The largest source of disbursements of payments out of India, as you well know, is people paying for their kids' education. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So India is very happy to spend its hard-earned rupees, right, in other countries if it's educating their kids. And so I think there's a real understanding there of the value of that and the value of hard work and willing to make, see what happens. I think so. Yeah. So talking about it in the slums is one place, but you see those same kinds of things happening at different levels across the whole country.
So as you're talking about education and things, Kevin, at this time, I would like to segue into your major work that you have done with Richard Florida. And you talked about that whole idea of creative economy. How do you really look at this idea of creative economy in the Indian context? And of course, with the kind of work that you've done in India and the kind of learnings that you've had from India.
So the whole thing with the creative economy, right, is really, it's about people who are being paid to think, right? That what you've kind of shifted. I mean, creativity has always been an important force in human endeavors in general, right? And you go back to the founding of the first cities, and it was people understanding, how to store grain and how to, animal husbandry and, other, those ideas, right? And implementing them. And what you see is more recently, and I think what Richard was really great at kind of tapping into was this kind of recognition that you kind of shifted to this point where the importance of kind of people who were thinking was much greater than the people who were doing, right? I mean, kind of in many ways, the technology and manufacturing technology and production technology, tons and tons of advancement in productivity in those areas, right? Coming from people who were, engineers and designers and others, computer scientists and other people, right? Who were coming up with all of these wonderful ideas. And so the kind of nexus, if you will, of economic activity shifted from doing to doing better, finding ways to do better, right? And so very much the idea becomes one of these people who are being paid to think, right? The creative economy, creative workers, right? And so it is technology workers. It is all artists, right? It also includes artists and designers and others, various business, finance, medical professionals, right? And educators, right? I mean, those are the kind of the main groups. And so you see that those people and their location choices, right? Where they are locating becomes really important. Even, I think still, with COVID, right, it gets muddied because now it's like, wait, I can live anywhere and work anywhere. Yeah, somewhat, right? Although I still think the underlying importance of co-location, of being around people who are doing similar things, the kind of cross-pollination you get of ideas and stuff. Right now in Toronto, we're doing what's called the Design TO Festival, which is a couple weeks long, just all kinds of celebrating all kinds of different design. And a lot of what's going on is its attempts to bring people together, right? Because actually sitting down and talking with someone, over a coffee or over a meal or a beer or whatever, is still way more, it's richer, it's more effective than this, right? This is fine, it can work. Having these kind of virtual conversations is okay, but I think a lot of innovation still comes from people being face to face, which means co-location, right? And so where creative workers decide to locate really helps drive what cities and regions become successful. And so I think you still see a lot of that. And so I think what you see, right, in India is we saw that, right? We still see, right, the kind of, again, looking at identifying here are the key kind of jobs and where are these people locating, and then what are some of the other economic outcomes from those regions, and you see that they're related, right? Correlation may not be causality, but it's a pretty good indicator. And so you do see that these things are happening, and we saw, right, that the places in India, right, where that have that, have again higher numbers of creative workers are the places that are doing better, economically and with other measures.
So, like creative economy, of course, you make a very important point, and I would like to bring in a question that has been asked by Sheridan here, that Silicon Valley leads because it generates more patents. What is India doing about its IP and patent policies and laws to stimulate job creation and growth? So what I'm really talking about here is like going back to that whole idea of creative economy. Like, of course, there is this whole creative class that happens in India, but there seems to be a very huge distance that you have to cover from a patenting viewpoint. Is patenting the right measure, or we have to look at other things as well? How do you look at it?
Yeah, I've done a lot of stuff with the patent data. Actually, I've worked with the US patent data, right? And it's messy. And it's not a bad measure, I will say, right? It's not necessarily it's not a real good one either, but it measures a certain level of things that activity, right? The demonstration of activity. I think you're better. Some of the other more economic outcome measures are better for looking at these kind of performance things. The one thing I will say as well, when we talk a little bit about education, one of the real challenges that India faces is its educational system, its post-secondary educational system. It is really bad, right? You still don't have a single institution in the top 400 in the world, right? And there's a reason why so many parents are spending so much money to pay for their kids to go to school out of country, right? So there has not been, and there's so much competition to get into the IITs and to some of what are the top schools in India, right? But yet, right, you don't have the global level of recognition or of things that are there. And I think that so much of, again, that drive, if the education system is more focused on just getting students through, then you're not getting innovation out of the education system as well, right? So much of why Silicon Valley is because of Stanford, right? Because of what the educational institutions that are there, and Caltech and some of the other ones, right? And what they've done and how they've interacted with industry and other things, right? The things that allow for the educational institution to be leveraged into an innovation economy, and how those things happen, right? And you don't have that educational piece within India is very weak. And that's unfortunate, right? And I think it's very difficult. It's hard to strengthen that, to be able to improve that. But I think part of what drives innovation, right, is the strength of the educational institutions.
So, Kevin, you're making a very important point. And right now, when India says, or always has been saying, that we are really looking at the future in terms of like India as a demographic dividend, how do you think we can set this education system right? Because there are issues at the foundational learning level, there are issues at the higher education level. So what is it, and how quickly should we do it to really exploit the demographic dividend, which is likely to taper off sometime in 2050?
Right. Yeah, and I think there's I don't know, really. It's a mess, and I have looked at what's there and how it's the challenge right now is the demand is so high for what are the higher ranked institutions, right? The number of people and the battles for students to get in, right? And everything that they go through in the exams and everything that they're doing to make sure that they can get in, right? Means that there has to be a focus on the students, right? And so you've got to be able to provide a really good outcome for the students, right? In terms of educational outcome and what you're doing. And so I think it's hard then to say, but yet, if you look at, I went to Carnegie Mellon, right? And you look at the institutions like that in the States where they are research as much as they are education, right? And it's how do you, it's getting more of an equal focus, right? And saying, well, no, we want researchers, we're going to support research. We've got things in place that, grants and programs and things that are supporting researchers and giving people the time and the recognition and making it part of their promotion and tenure decision and doing a whole bunch of other things, right? The patents is yet another good, one of the interesting ones. You talk to a lot of universities. There are only a handful of universities, even in the US, that will actually recognize an awarded patent as valid for a promotion and tenure decision, right? Well, look, if you want to increase the number of patents, let's reward faculty for getting patents, right? There's things that you can do that, but it changes the structure, right, of the way things work. And so much of it right now, right, the way, if you look at the kind of the educational system, even the way educators are treated and the way they're thought of, right, within, they're kind of almost a lower level of civil servant, right? So they're not, you don't have that same, you look at, being hair doctor professor in Germany means a hell of a lot more even to that society than being, right, a tenured full professor at any institution in India. Why is that, right? It does, why, how do you change that? What do you do? And how do you make some of it? So they're bigger, longer changes, right? It's longer term kind of changes that have to be made. But at some level, you need to really be able to say, no, we need to think about rewarding research and research outputs and thinking about innovation that way.
And so just trying to build up on this whole creative economy idea, like you always say there are 3 T's or possibly 4 T's if you want to: technology, tolerance, and talent and territorial assets. How do you think this interplay is going to be important for India in the future? Because, and I'm asking that question for a simple reason, that there is a lot of criticism that happens of India on tolerance issues at points in time, criticism on the basis of what do you call it, talent not being right. In fact, that is exactly what we were alluding to. Now, how do you really look at this interaction?
So what you see is that you need to do well on all of them, right? When Rise of the Creative Class first came out, one of the things that I remember, this is very shortly after the book came out, Richard got into essentially an op-ed argument with the mayor of New Orleans in the Times-Picayune of New Orleans, right? Because the mayor was incensed that New Orleans was not higher scoring on the creativity index, because doesn't he know what an amazing, tolerant, and fabulous place New Orleans is, and that we should clearly, that all this stuff that you're talking about how important tolerance and diversity are, that La Bon Temps Roland, we celebrate this. This is what makes New Orleans, New Orleans, right? And Richard's point, quite rightly, was, yeah, but your technology sucks. You don't have any real good tech firms. You don't have anything going on, but you're missing elements of this, right? One on its own, being really strong on one is not sufficient, right? What's required is that you do well on all of them, right? Or at least, you do fairly well on most of them, and maybe really well on one or two is fine. But so it does require, some balance, right? And saying you can't just focus on one. So yes, fixing the talent system, getting better education, it's important, right? And education helps with technology, the technology and innovation piece. That's great, right? And the tolerance one is important. That it's not, but what does that really mean? And it's really about inclusion, right? It's not necessarily, the tolerance is that it's really much more about being inclusive. It's tolerance and diversity are measurements. Inclusion is an action. And so what does that really mean? And how do and inclusive places are places, yes, they're open to new people and new ideas, right? That's part of what makes, I think, why it's so successful from a creative economy perspective. And the territory stuff, right? The territory assets, again, that's what attracts people. People still need co-location still matters, being around others. You might not be around them 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, but you still need to, I think, be around other people. You can't just go live on a mountain someplace and telecommute in for work every day, and be as successful as if you are working downtown and can, and go to Connaught and have a coffee with somebody and have a discussion. It's a very different place. And so I do think all of those things, it's really saying, how do you kind of leverage and perform well on all of them? You kind of need to raise them all to really get that synergistic effect.
Mhm. And so, like one very interesting question, I've never asked that in a conversation like this, but since you come from this whole idea of everything works together point of view, how do you think culture plays a role in urbanization processes? How does this actually have a huge place? Because when I'm asking about culture, for a simple reason, like India possibly has the oldest city that civilization that exists in the world right now, which is
Oldest continuously occupied.
yes, oldest continuously occupied city of Varanasi.
Yeah.
So that means culture has a huge bearing, but it has a lot of religious activity, but limited economic activity or whatever. But that is possibly true for most of the what I call Indo-Gigantic plain, like cities which were there in the past as well. They have not really had huge economic activity. What is really happening? Like, what do you think has transformed? What has changed? Because the cities that we are talking about, which do exceedingly well, are mostly southern cities and things. But out here in the north, they have somehow not done so well.
Well, it's a bunch of things, I think. But I mean, one of the key things, and I was just having this conversation actually with somebody at dinner the other day about the Maritimes here in Canada, right? So New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, right? And how very much what happens there echoes the same kinds of things that I saw when I was living in Pittsburgh. Right? I was in Carnegie Mellon, right? And so when I was living in Pittsburgh. And that is both places underwent significant economic downturns. In the case of the Maritimes, it was the loss of the fishing industry, hugely impacted their economy, tremendous job losses, all kinds of problems. And they still, to this day, it's been decades, but even still, they're paying a price from that. Pittsburgh is now kind of finally coming out of what happened when a lot of the steel mills closed, right? It is a much more interesting and lively place, even than it was when I first moved there 25 years ago. But what you see in both places is this attitude of you're not one of us, right? What Maritimers call as being from away. We actually have a whole musical about Come From Away that talks about what happened when a whole bunch of planes on 9/11 were forced to land in the Maritimes because they couldn't land anywhere else. And kind of what happened, right? But it very much you have this attitude of, well, you're not one of us, right? You're an outsider, you're from away, right? And the same thing very much true in Pittsburgh. And what you see from that, right, is that it creates barriers. It creates this wall, or it creates this exclusion, and it just kind of, people who aren't part of what's there feel like they're outsiders. And so the reason why kind of tolerance and inclusion, I think why it's so important and why we specifically kind of hit on it and talk about it and think about it, is very much it helps to break down those kind of barriers, right? And so I think that part of what you get there, I mean, India's had issues, right? I mean, and I still think you guys don't blame the Brits near as much as you should for a lot of the issues that you have. Well, you blame them for a lot, and they deserve it. They refuse to own up to it, but they're responsible. And they still left you a whole bunch that you're still stuck with, right? Congratulations on the new temple. A little worried about the mosque that used to be there, right? But these kinds of issues, they're long standing and very difficult, right? And so it's the places that manage that either don't have those same challenges. Again, the South didn't have the same problems with the Raj, right? Or didn't have, or doesn't have the same kind of population issues and stuff. But it's how do you understand? How do you help overcome some of these things? And often they're like, one of the things we hit on early on was the gay and lesbian index, right? And it's not like having lots of gays and lesbians in your community made you a better place. I think it does, But really what it was a signal that you were a community that was open to people who might be different. And sometimes those people who are different are people like Steve Jobs, right? They want you to, he thinks differently, right? That's what he did, right? And a whole bunch of other people who are the same way. Elon Musk, perhaps, right, as well, right? But you get, and so it's like, and a whole bunch of other people at a much smaller scale. And so you need to be able to figure out, okay, fine. I don't necessarily have to be, being inclusive doesn't mean I have to be exclusive. I don't have to exclude other. It's more saying, look, okay, we're good. We're doing what we're doing, but you can do what you do, and how do we figure out? But how can we be welcoming and still create an environment and a community where we say, no, we actually, you can be an outsider and be successful here, right? And again, people who see outsiders as being successful think this is a place I want to be because I'm going to be an outsider, but I want to be successful. And so I think it's getting people to understand that, and really seeing how, and how to do that, right? How to square that particular circle. Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. I do think there's a lot of things that India, quite honestly, right, is an incredibly diverse place. And with all of the various people and populations and, languages, I mean, only India, I think, cares about language more than Canada does. God, the way we are with language here. But all of the different, so there are all of these other kinds of diversity that are there, not just religious, right? All these other kinds of diversity that are there that people tend not to have a lot of problems with. And it's like, well, why? It's like, wait, let's figure this out. Let's make that, how do we build that into something more? And so I do think there's a lot of opportunity there, that hasn't really been tapped as well, but a large part of it is really being able to say, hey, look, this is, here's why these things matter, right? This is why this is important, and what you can see it working and see how it works in places. And so it's trying to figure out how to do more of that.
Mhm. So one last question, Kevin. I know the time's getting over, so we're just nearly on the hour. But what do you think are the prospects for India? And if you have to solve for some of the challenges of India, what would you like to do?
I mean, like I said, I think it's always, it's like right there, right? I always seem like it's just like, it's so close to really like stepping out, and taking a much larger role, right? Being able to play a larger role. I think, if any, I mean, I think the two biggest things that, that I would try to figure out are the post-secondary education system, right? And what really needs to happen and how to really make some, I mean, you've got huge numbers and tremendous numbers of students, right? Just the people and being able to, and how to be able to do that. But what does it really take to create a much more meaningful and effective education system that has a global presence, right? I mean, why aren't you getting the rest of the world clamoring to come to go to school in India? You should be, right? That's something you should, I think it would be achievable in a decade, right? To have schools that people from the rest of the world, why aren't the Chinese knocking down your door saying, hey, we want to come to school here, right? No, they're going to Australia, they're coming to Canada, they're going to the UK, right? They're going to the US, as the same place as India's students are going, right? But how do you get there? And so I think the education part is one. And then I do think, right, the kind of the inclusion piece and understanding, again, celebrating more what some of the differences are and figuring out ways to recognize that and work with that, I think would help a lot as well.
So great. Like, I think on this note, Kevin, we would bring this conversation to a close. Like, we could have talked on this for hours.
I know we can, and we will.
Yes, I'm sure. And look forward to meeting you in 4 weeks at the India Dialogue Summit at Stanford. In fact, before I close, I would like to just tell everybody here on the program that we have the India Dialogue Summit happening on February 29 and March 1, 2024. On the campus, it's going to be one hell of a program, or an amazing program. Kevin is going to be part of it. In fact, we have Nirvikar here who has joined online. He's also going to be there. So we are looking at some fascinating conversations now over the 2 days on India and what the future of India looks like. So we are continuing with the effort on the India Dialogue Initiative here, and we are hugely positive in terms of the positive impact that we are able to create through these conversations and research activity that we are doing and continuing this effort over the years. But thanks a lot, Kevin, for joining. It was such a pleasure to have you, and look forward to meeting you soon.